The morning mist clung to the mountain valley like a shroud, wrapping around the pine trees that lined the rushing river below. Marcus Rivera adjusted his worn baseball cap as he guided his battered pickup truck along the winding dirt road that led to his favorite fishing spot. In the passenger seat, his 8-year-old daughter Sofia dozed fitfully, her small hand clutching the thermos of hot chocolate he'd prepared before dawn. The purple circles under her eyes had grown darker over the past month, a constant reminder of the sleepless nights that had become their new normal since the diagnosis. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The words still felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he'd never wanted to learn. But Sofia was strong, stronger than any 8-year-old should have to be, and she'd insisted on their traditional Saturday morning fishing trip, despite the chemotherapy that left her exhausted and nauseous. Marcus had learned not to argue with his daughter's fierce determination. It was the same stubborn streak that had gotten her mother through nursing school while working double shifts at the diner, the same fire that had burned bright until cancer extinguished it 3 years ago. Now it was just the two of them, facing down another giant with nothing but hope and whatever strength they could muster together. The river roared with spring snowmelt, its chocolate-brown waters churning white where they crashed against the granite boulders that dotted the stream. Marcus parked near the old wooden bridge that spanned the narrowest part of the gorge, a structure that had been deemed unsafe by the county years ago but remained standing through some combination of stubborn engineering and mountain folklore. He'd been fishing these waters since he was Sofia's age, when his own father would bring him here to escape the suffocating poverty of their trailer park home. The river had always been a place of refuge, where the world's problems seemed smaller against the backdrop of ancient stone and rushing water. But today the current ran faster and angrier than he'd ever seen it, swollen with the unseasonable warmth that had melted the snowpack too quickly. The sound was deafening, a constant thunder that made conversation impossible except in shouts. Sofia stirred as he cut the engine, her dark eyes opening to take in the wild scene before them. The smile that spread across her pale face reminded Marcus why they'd made this pilgrimage, despite every rational voice in his head warning him to stay home. 20 miles upstream, in a world that might as well have existed on another planet, Victoria Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her mountain retreat, watching the same churning waters through binoculars that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The modern glass and steel structure perched on the cliff like a bird of prey, all clean lines and expensive views, a monument to the kind of success that insulated its owner from the messier realities of life below. At 42, Victoria commanded a technology empire that employed thousands and generated billions, her face gracing magazine covers as the embodiment of female entrepreneurial triumph. But success, she'd learned, was a cold companion that offered little comfort during the long nights when sleep eluded her and the weight of her choices pressed down like a physical thing. The retreat had been purchased as an escape, a place to decompress from the relentless demands of corporate warfare, but even here, the ghosts of her past found ways to intrude. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from her assistant, her board members, her ex-husband's lawyers, each notification a reminder that her problems had a way of following her regardless of altitude or isolation. She'd come to the mountains to think, to process the devastating news that had arrived in the manila envelope 3 days earlier. The private investigator's report contained 20 years of meticulous research, photographs, and documents that painted a picture she'd spent her adult life trying to forget. The daughter she'd given up for adoption when she was barely out of college, the child she'd convinced herself was better off without her, had grown up just 200 miles away. The girl was 8 now, the same age Victoria had been when her own mother walked out, leaving behind nothing but debt and disappointment. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd become everything she'd once despised about her mother, choosing career over family, ambition over love, success over the kind of messy human connections that made life meaningful. The investigator's files revealed that her daughter was sick, fighting a battle that money could win, but pride and fear had prevented Victoria from joining. Every day she delayed contact was another day stolen from whatever relationship might be possible, but the weight of her abandonment felt too heavy to bear. The decision to drive down to the river had been impulsive, driven by a restless energy that made sitting still impossible. Her luxury SUV handled the mountain roads with the kind of effortless competence that money could buy, but as she descended toward the valley floor, something felt different about the world outside her climate-controlled bubble. The trees seemed greener, the air cleaner, the very landscape more alive than the manicured perfection of her usual environments. Perhaps it was the proximity to her daughter, the knowledge that somewhere in this valley lived the piece of herself she'd given away. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that all her success meant nothing if she died alone, surrounded by expensive things instead of people who actually mattered. The river called to her with a voice she didn't recognize, promising answers to questions she'd been afraid to ask. Marcus had just finished rigging Sofia's fishing rod when the sound reached them over the river's roar, a metallic screaming that spoke of disaster unfolding. He looked up to see a black SUV careening down the steep embankment on the far side of the bridge, its driver fighting for control as the vehicle bounced and slid toward the churning water. Time seemed to slow as Marcus watched the SUV hit a fallen log and launch into the air, spinning once before crashing into the river with a splash that sent spray 20 feet into the air. The current immediately grabbed the vehicle, rolling it over and dragging it toward the rapids that marked the beginning of a gorge from which no one had ever emerged alive. Without thinking, Marcus vaulted over the truck's tailgate and sprinted toward the water, his construction boots skidding on the wet rocks as he tried to find a safe entry point. Behind him, Sofia's voice rose in a scream that cut through even the river's thunder, but there was no time to comfort her, no time for anything except the desperate arithmetic of rescue that his mind calculated with each passing second. The SUV was already 50 yards downstream when Marcus plunged into the icy water, the shock of it driving the breath from his lungs and turning his muscles to lead. The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, a living thing that grabbed at his legs and tried to pull him under with every step. He'd been a strong swimmer in high school, had even worked as a lifeguard during a brief stint at the community college before Sofia was born, and responsibility demanded more reliable income. But this wasn't the calm waters of a municipal pool. This was mountain water, fed by snowmelt and angry with spring runoff, water that killed without mercy or discrimination. He could see a figure trapped inside the SUV as it tumbled through the rapids, could make out long blonde hair floating like kelp as the vehicle filled with water. The roof had caved in on one side, and the passenger door hung open at an impossible angle, but the driver's side was still partially above water, providing an air pocket that wouldn't last long against the hydraulic forces trying to tear the vehicle apart. Victoria's world had become a kaleidoscope of water and metal, her consciousness flickering in and out as the SUV rolled through the rapids like a washing machine filled with broken glass. She'd managed to release her seatbelt before the vehicle went under, but her left arm was pinned between the seat and the crushed door frame, sending lightning bolts of pain up her shoulder with every impact against the rocks. The water was shockingly cold, a cold that reached into her bones and made thinking nearly impossible. Part of her mind, the analytical part that had built an empire through careful calculation, observed her situation with clinical detachment. The air pocket was shrinking with each roll of the vehicle. Her arm was broken, possibly in multiple places. The current was carrying her toward a section of river that local maps marked with warnings about hidden rocks and deadly hydraulics. By any reasonable measure, she was going to die here, another statistic in the mountain's long history of claiming the unprepared and unlucky. But another part of her mind, a part she'd thought buried under years of corporate hardening, rebelled against the mathematics of death. She hadn't found her daughter yet. She hadn't made amends for the choice that had haunted every success and poisoned every triumph. There were words that needed speaking, forgiveness that needed seeking, love that needed expressing before the ledger of her life could be closed. The first attempt to reach the SUV nearly cost Marcus his life, as the current slammed him into a boulder with enough force to crack ribs. He surfaced gasping, his vision blurred by impact in cold water, but managed to grab a overhanging branch that stopped his downstream progress. The SUV was still visible, now lodged against a pile of debris that included a fallen tree and what looked like parts of someone's deck that had been torn loose by the spring floods. The vehicle was nose down in the water, its rear wheels spinning slowly in the current like some mechanical prayer wheel marking time, until gravity and hydraulics finished their work. From his position 30 feet away, Marcus could see that the air pocket inside was shrinking rapidly, compressed by the water pressure into an ever smaller bubble that represented the difference between life and death for whoever was trapped inside. He built houses for 15 years, understood the physics of structural failure, and the inevitable progression from stability to collapse. The SUV wouldn't last another 5 minutes before the current shifted it into deeper water, where rescue would become impossible. Sofia's voice carried across the water, high and desperate, calling for her father to come back. to let someone else handle the rescue, to choose her over the stranger who'd driven too fast on a dangerous road. The sound cut through Marcus like a blade, reminding him of his responsibilities, of the little girl who'd already lost her mother and couldn't afford to lose him too. But he'd seen the person inside the SUV, had caught a glimpse of blonde hair and a designer jacket that spoke of someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's everything. How could he explain to Sofia that some strangers weren't strangers at all, that sometimes the universe presented tests that revealed who you really were beneath the skin? His own father had failed such a test, walking away from a car accident because helping would have meant being late for work, because other people's emergencies weren't his problem. Marcus had been 12 when he learned that his father was a coward, had spent years trying to scrub that knowledge from his soul. He wouldn't pass that poison to Sofia, wouldn't teach her that love was rationed according to blood relations and personal convenience. The second attempt brought him close enough to touch the SUV's rear bumper, close enough to see the woman inside fighting against the physics that were trying to claim her. She was older than he'd first thought, maybe 40, with the kind of bone structure that suggested good genetics and expensive dental work. Her clothes were what his ex-wife would have called sophisticated, the kind of casual wealth that cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. But none of that mattered now, not when her eyes met his through the distorted lens of moving water, and he saw something he recognized from his own mirror during the dark months after his wife's death. The look of someone who'd given up, who'd decided that fighting was more expensive than surrender, who'd calculated the odds and found them wanting. It was a look that spoke of isolation and regret, of choices that couldn't be undone and time that couldn't be recovered. Marcus grabbed the SUV's roof rack and pulled himself closer, fighting against the current that wanted to sweep him past this moment and into the relative safety of deeper water where his own survival would be assured. Victoria saw him before she fully understood what she was seeing. A figure in work clothes and a baseball cap who moved through the deadly water with the kind of purposeful determination that spoke of someone accustomed to physical labor and difficult decisions. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by the kind of lines that came from squinting at problems until solutions emerged. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place where they might have met. Perhaps he was a contractor who'd worked on one of her properties, or a maintenance worker she'd passed in some corporate hallway. The distinction mattered less than the fact that he was here, risking everything for a stranger who'd been careless enough to challenge a mountain road during runoff season. She tried to speak, to warn him away from a rescue that was likely to claim 2 lives instead of 1, but the words emerged as bubbles that rose toward the shrinking air pocket without carrying any meaning. Her trapped arm had gone numb, which probably meant nerve damage or worse, but the pain in her chest had nothing to do with physical injury and everything to do with the recognition that she was about to die without ever meeting the daughter she'd abandoned. The moment Marcus's hand touched hers through the broken window marked a transition from calculation to pure faith, from the known world of measured risks to a place where only will and luck determined outcomes. The woman's eyes were blue, he noticed, the kind of pale blue that reminded him of winter sky just before snow. Her grip was weak but desperate, like someone clinging to the edge of a cliff while the ground crumbled beneath their feet. He could feel the SUV shifting in the current, the debris pile that held it starting to give way under the relentless pressure of moving water. There was maybe 2 minutes before the vehicle broke free and tumbled into the gorge where the river disappeared between walls of granite that had never given up their dead. 2 minutes to extract a trapped woman using nothing but determination and whatever tools the situation provided. The passenger door was completely destroyed, folded inward like origami made of steel and desperation. But the driver's side window had shattered completely, leaving an opening just large enough for someone to fit through, if they were willing to risk everything on the mathematics of human flexibility, and the possibility that bones could bend without breaking. The extraction took 90 seconds that felt like hours, each movement calculated against the SUV's increasing instability and the woman's fading consciousness. Marcus had to dislocate her shoulder to free her trapped arm, an injury that would heal given time and proper medical care, but which drew a scream that seemed to come from the deepest parts of her soul. She passed out during the worst of it, which was probably a mercy given the amount of damage necessary to save her life. When her limp body finally came free of the wreckage, Marcus wrapped his arms around her waist and kicked away from the SUV just as the debris pile collapsed and the current claimed its prize. The vehicle disappeared beneath the surface with a grinding roar of metal against stone, dragging with it everything except the 2 figures who now tumbled through the rapids, locked in an embrace that was part rescue and part controlled drowning. Marcus managed to angle their trajectory toward a eddy pool where the current slowed enough for him to find footing on the rocky bottom, his boots slipping on algae-covered stones as he fought to keep both their heads above water. Sofia was waiting on the bank when Marcus finally dragged Victoria's unconscious form onto the muddy shore, her small face white with terror and relief in equal measure. She'd had the presence of mind to call 911 from Marcus's cell phone, though the dispatcher warned that the mountain rescue team was dealing with multiple emergencies caused by the spring floods, and response time would be at least 30 minutes. Sofia had also retrieved the first aid kit from the truck, along with the emergency blankets that Marcus kept for camping trips they could no longer afford but still planned for better times. Together, father and daughter worked to stabilize the woman who'd crashed into their lives with the sudden violence of mountain weather. Her pulse was weak but steady, her breathing shallow but regular. The dislocated shoulder was the most obvious injury, but Marcus suspected internal damage from the impact and possible hypothermia from her time in the glacial water. He'd seen enough construction accidents to recognize the signs of serious trauma hidden beneath surface wounds, understood that people could walk away from crashes that killed them hours later when adrenaline wore off and shock gave way to reality. Victoria's return to consciousness was gradual and disorienting, like surfacing from depths where light and sound behaved according to different rules. She became aware first of warmth, then of pain that seemed to radiate from every nerve ending in her body. Her shoulder felt wrong, disconnected somehow, and her mouth tasted of river water and blood. When she finally managed to open her eyes, the first thing she saw was a little girl with dark hair and serious brown eyes, who was studying her with the intensity of a doctor making a diagnosis. The child wore clothes that had seen better days, hand-me-downs or thrift store finds that had been carefully maintained but couldn't hide their origins. But her smile was radiant, the kind of pure joy that seemed to light the world from within. Somewhere behind the girl, a man's voice was speaking in urgent tones to what sounded like emergency dispatch, providing GPS coordinates and medical information with the competence of someone accustomed to crisis management. The voice was familiar, though Victoria couldn't place it through the fog of pain and confusion that clouded her thinking. When Marcus knelt beside her, Victoria saw his face clearly for the first time, and felt the world shift in ways that had nothing to do with her injuries. She knew this man, had been carrying his image in her memory for 8 years without understanding why. He was older now, marked by worry lines and the kind of weariness that spoke of too many responsibilities and not enough resources. But it was definitely him, the factory worker who'd been dating her daughter's adoptive mother, the man who'd been present at every school play and soccer game during the brief period when Victoria had allowed herself to spy on the life she'd given away. The private investigator's files had mentioned him in passing, noting that he'd married the adoptive mother and become Sofia's stepfather, then later that he'd become her sole guardian when cancer claimed his wife. But seeing him here, recognizing him as the man who'd just risked everything to save her life, felt like the universe playing a joke so elaborate that it transcended coincidence and entered the realm of cosmic intervention. Sofia moved closer, her small hand touching Victoria's forehead with the gentle confidence of someone accustomed to caring for sick people. "You're gonna be okay," she said in a voice that carried absolute conviction. "My dad saved you from the river, and he's really good at fixing things that are broken." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, not because of what they said, but because of who was saying them. This was her daughter, the child she'd given away to ensure a better life, the girl whose existence had haunted every success and poisoned every triumph. 8 years of wondering, of imagining, of carefully maintained distance, collapsed into this moment of recognition that felt both inevitable and impossible. Sofia had her father's eyes but her mother's stubborn chin, the same determined set to her features that Victoria recognized from childhood photographs of herself. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable to someone who'd been studying family genetics in stolen moments for the better part of a decade. The ambulance arrived as Victoria was trying to process the impossible mathematics of fate that had brought her daughter within arm's reach, through circumstances that might have killed them both. The paramedics were efficient and professional, loading her onto a backboard and into the vehicle with the kind of practice competence that spoke of too much experience with mountain rescues. Marcus answered their questions about the extraction, while Sofia hovered nearby, clearly reluctant to be separated from the stranger her father had saved. Victoria tried to speak, to explain who she was and why this moment felt like the convergence of every choice she'd ever made. But the words wouldn't come. Perhaps it was the pain medication the paramedics had administered, or perhaps it was simply the weight of recognizing that some conversations were too important to risk getting wrong. Instead, she let herself be carried away from the river that had nearly claimed her, carrying with her the image of Sofia's concerned face and the knowledge that the daughter she'd abandoned had somehow saved her in return by being exactly where she needed to be when the universe finally decided to balance its books. The regional medical center sat in the valley like a monument to the kind of practical architecture that prioritized function over form, its brown brick facade and small windows. Speaking of budgets stretched thin and communities that made do with less than they deserved, Victoria found herself in a private room that was clean but Spartan, equipped with the basic necessities for healing, but none of the amenities that money usually provided. The view from her window showed a parking lot filled with pickup trucks and economy cars, vehicles that belonged to people who worked with their hands and worried about gas prices. It was a world away from the luxury medical facilities where she usually received care, places where marble floors and original artwork disguised the fundamental business of human suffering and recovery. But there was something comforting about the unpretentious honesty of this place, the sense that healing happened here without regard for insurance coverage or social status. The nurses treated her with the same gentle competence they showed every patient, measuring pain and progress against human need rather than ability to pay. Marcus and Sofia had disappeared shortly after the ambulance arrived, leaving Victoria alone with questions that multiplied faster than the pain medication could suppress them. The official story, as related by the emergency room doctor, was straightforward enough. She'd lost control of her vehicle on a mountain road, crashed into the river, and been rescued by a local resident who happened to be fishing nearby. Her injuries included a dislocated shoulder, 2 cracked ribs, and severe bruising, along with mild hypothermia from her time in the glacial water. She'd been unconscious for approximately 6 minutes, which was long enough to cause concern, but not long enough to indicate serious brain injury. The doctor expected a full recovery given proper rest and physical therapy, though he warned that the shoulder would require surgery to repair the ligament damage caused by the extraction. It was the kind of medical summary that reduced trauma to statistics, transforming a near-death experience into data points that could be filed away and forgotten. But Victoria couldn't forget the moment of recognition when she'd looked into Sofia's eyes and seen her own childhood staring back. The 8 years she'd spent wondering about her daughter's welfare, imagining different scenarios for their eventual reunion, none of them had included being pulled unconscious from a river by the man who'd become Sofia's father. The private investigator's files lay scattered in her memory like puzzle pieces that suddenly formed a picture she'd been afraid to see. Marcus Rivera, age 34, widowed father working construction to support his stepdaughter through a leukemia diagnosis that would have bankrupted most families. The medical bills alone exceeded 6 figures, a burden that would have been impossible without the insurance coverage provided by his union job, and the charity care programs that kept families like his from drowning in debt. Every photograph in the investigator's file showed the same thing, a man who'd taken on responsibilities that weren't originally his and carried them with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that love wasn't about blood relations but about showing up when it mattered most. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria that she'd spent 20 years building a fortune large enough to solve every problem her daughter faced, while remaining too afraid to acknowledge that such problems existed. The medical bills that kept Marcus awake at night represented pocket change compared to her quarterly bonuses, but pride and fear had created a distance that money couldn't bridge. She'd convinced herself that her daughter was better off without her, that the chaos and ambition that defined Victoria's world would contaminate the stability that adoptive parents could provide. But lying in a hospital bed that smelled of disinfectant and other people's suffering, Victoria finally understood that her noble self-sacrifice had been nothing more than elaborate cowardice dressed up as maternal love. Sofia needed medical care that her father couldn't afford, but Victoria had been too afraid of rejection to offer help that might be interpreted as an attempt to buy forgiveness for abandonment. The knock on her door came just as Victoria was beginning to drift into the kind of medicated sleep that promised temporary escape from the weight of her realizations. Marcus stood in the doorway holding a small bouquet of wildflowers that looked like they'd been picked from the hospital's landscaping, his construction boots cleaned but still bearing traces of river mud. Sofia peeked around his legs, her serious dark eyes taking in the medical equipment and sterile environment with the familiarity of someone who'd spent too much time in similar rooms. They looked uncertain, like visitors who weren't sure they belonged in this antiseptic world of healing and high-tech intervention. Victoria felt her throat close with emotion she couldn't name, recognition mixing with regret in proportions that made breathing difficult. Here was her daughter, the child she'd wondered about and worried over from a distance measured in years and miles and choices that couldn't be undone. Marcus approached the bed with the careful movements of someone accustomed to sick rooms and the delicate protocols they demanded. "The nurses said you were awake," he said, his voice carrying the kind of gentle formality reserved for strangers who'd shared extraordinary circumstances. "We wanted to check on you before visiting hours ended." Sofia moved closer to the bed, her small hand reaching out to touch the rail, as if needing physical contact to confirm that the woman her father had saved was real and recovering. The gesture was so unconsciously trusting that Victoria felt her carefully maintained composure crack like ice under sudden warmth. This child, her child, was standing close enough to touch, looking at her with concern and curiosity, but no recognition of the biological connection that had shaped every major decision of Victoria's adult life. The knowledge felt like carrying a secret too large for one person to hold, a truth that demanded sharing but risked destroying the careful balance that had allowed Sofia to thrive in Marcus's care. Victoria's first words came out as a whisper, her voice still hoarse from the river water she'd inhaled during the rescue. "Thank you," she managed, the phrase inadequate to encompass the scope of what Marcus had done. "The doctor said you saved my life." Marcus shrugged with the self-conscious modesty of someone unused to being praised for doing what seemed obviously right. "Anyone would have done the same thing," he replied, though Victoria knew from long experience that such generosity was rarer than people wanted to admit. Sofia stepped closer to the bed, her expression serious as she studied Victoria's bandaged shoulder and the various monitors that tracked her vital signs. "Does it hurt very much?" she asked, with the direct concern that only children could manage without seeming intrusive. Victoria nodded, then immediately regretted the movement as pain shot through her neck and shoulder. "Some," she admitted, "but it's getting better." The conversation felt surreal, this careful dance around a relationship that existed but couldn't be acknowledged, words chosen to maintain distance while every instinct screamed for connection. Marcus pulled a chair closer to the bed, settling into it with the weary grace of someone who'd spent long hours in hospital waiting rooms. "The sheriff wants to talk to you when you're feeling up to it," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Just routine questions about the accident. They're trying to figure out if there were mechanical problems with your vehicle, or if the road conditions were worse than posted." Victoria nodded, though her memory of the moments before the crash remained frustratingly unclear. She remembered driving down the mountain road, remembered feeling restless and uncertain about the decisions that had brought her to this valley, but the specific details of losing control remained lost in the chaos of impact and cold water, and the desperate struggle for survival. Perhaps it was better that way, she thought. Some moments were too violent to replay, too traumatic to examine closely without risking further damage to an already fragile psyche. Sofia had been studying Victoria's face with the intensity of an artist memorizing a subject, and now she spoke with the blunt honesty that adults envied and feared in equal measure. "You look like someone I know," she said, her head tilted slightly as she tried to place the resemblance. "But I can't remember who." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, recognition stirring in the genetic memory that connected mother and daughter across years of separation. Marcus shot his daughter a look that warned against getting too personal with strangers, but Sofia continued with the fearless curiosity that had always characterized her interactions with the world. "Do you have any kids?" she asked, and Victoria felt the careful control she'd maintained since waking up begin to crumble. The truth sat in her throat like a stone, too large to swallow and too dangerous to speak, especially here in front of the man who'd given his life to raising the daughter Victoria had abandoned. The lie came easier than expected, flowing from years of practice at maintaining the careful fiction that had allowed her to build an empire while avoiding the complicated emotions of motherhood. "No," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the way the words seemed to burn on her tongue. "I never had children. My career always came first." It was technically true, she told herself, a careful parsing of facts that acknowledged her role in Sofia's creation while denying any claim to the more important work of actually raising her. Sofia nodded with the solemn acceptance of someone too young to understand the weight of such choices, but Marcus's expression suggested a deeper comprehension of what it meant to prioritize ambition over family. His own wife had died trying to balance motherhood with a nursing career, working double shifts to pay for medical school while fighting the cancer that would eventually claim her. The sacrifice and struggle that defined his world stood in sharp contrast to Victoria's comfortable distance from consequence, her ability to make choices without bearing their full cost. The conversation might have continued in this careful territory of polite evasion, but Sofia's attention was drawn to something beyond the hospital room window. "Look, Daddy," she said, pointing toward the parking lot where a black sedan had pulled up near the emergency entrance. "That car looks just like the one that lady drives." Marcus followed his daughter's gaze and felt his stomach drop as he recognized the vehicle that belonged to Dr. Patterson, Sofia's oncologist. The woman never made unscheduled visits, never appeared without advance notice, unless the news couldn't wait for regular appointment times. Marcus had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded difficult conversations, understood that doctors who dealt with childhood cancer developed their own protocols for delivering information that parents weren't ready to hear. The fact that Dr. Patterson was here, now, in the evening hours when most medical professionals were home with their own families, suggested that Sofia's latest test results had revealed something that couldn't wait until Monday morning. Victoria watched Marcus's face change as he processed the implications of the doctor's unexpected arrival, saw the careful composure of someone accustomed to crisis give way to the naked fear of a parent facing the unthinkable. Sofia seemed oblivious to the tension that had suddenly filled the room, chattering about the flowers that lined the hospital's entrance walkway and speculating about whether they were real or plastic. But Marcus had gone very still, his attention focused entirely on the figure making her way through the hospital's automatic doors, with the purposeful stride of someone carrying news that couldn't be delayed. Victoria felt like an intruder witnessing a private moment of family crisis, but leaving now would require explanations she wasn't prepared to give. Instead, she lay quietly in her hospital bed, watching the man who'd saved her life prepare to receive information that might destroy the carefully constructed world he'd built around his daughter's survival. The knock on the door came exactly 5 minutes later, just enough time for Dr. Patterson to navigate the hospital's corridors and prepare whatever words she'd chosen for this conversation. She was a small woman in her 50s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of gentle competence that made delivering terrible news slightly more bearable. Marcus stood to greet her, his body language shifting into the defensive posture of someone expecting a blow. Sofia remained focused on the window, humming quietly to herself while tracing patterns in the condensation that had formed on the glass. The scene felt frozen in the moment before impact, like a photograph taken just before disaster struck and changed everything forever. Victoria found herself holding her breath, though she had no right to participate in this family's crisis, no standing to offer comfort or support to the man who'd risked everything to save her life. Dr. Patterson's words were carefully chosen, delivered with the practiced gentleness of someone who'd learned that bad news required its own specialized vocabulary. Sofia's latest blood work showed changes that suggested her current treatment protocol wasn't working as effectively as hoped. The cancer hadn't progressed dramatically, but it wasn't responding to chemotherapy with the enthusiasm that characterized successful cases. They needed to consider more aggressive options, treatments that carried greater risks but offered better chances of long-term survival. The conversation would require private discussion between doctor and parent, detailed explanations of statistics and side effects that weren't appropriate for 8-year-old ears. Could Marcus meet with her in the morning to discuss their options? The question was posed as a request, but everyone in the room understood that it was really a command disguised as courtesy, a necessary step in the dance that surrounded childhood illness and the terrible choices it demanded from people who loved too much to make them easily. Marcus's response came in a voice that Victoria barely recognized, stripped of the easy confidence he displayed during her rescue and reduced to the raw uncertainty of a parent facing the limits of love's power to heal. "How much time do we have?" he asked, the question encompassing both immediate decisions and larger questions about Sofia's future that no one wanted to voice directly. Dr. Patterson's answer was diplomatic but clear. They had time to make thoughtful choices, time to explore options and seek second opinions if Marcus wanted them. But they didn't have time to delay indefinitely, didn't have the luxury of hoping that current treatments would suddenly become more effective through some miracle of medical intervention. Sofia's condition was serious enough to require decisive action, the kind of choices that parents dreamed they'd never have to make, but which circumstances sometimes demanded with brutal clarity. Victoria lay in her hospital bed, listening to this exchange, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what the universe had arranged through her accident and rescue. She'd spent 8 years wondering about her daughter's welfare from a safe distance, imagining scenarios for eventual contact that always seemed to require perfect timing and ideal circumstances. But perfection was a luxury that people facing medical crises couldn't afford, and ideal circumstances rarely emerged from the chaos of real life. Here was her daughter, the child she'd given away to ensure a better future, facing a battle that money could help win, but which required more than financial resources to fight successfully. The treatments Dr. Patterson was describing, the experimental protocols and specialized facilities, were exactly the kind of options that Victoria's wealth could access, but which remained beyond the reach of families like Marcus's, no matter how much love and determination they brought to the fight. The weight of recognition settled on Victoria like a physical thing, pressing down on her chest with the force of accumulated years and unspoken regrets. This wasn't coincidence or cosmic intervention, she realized. This was opportunity disguised as crisis, chance wrapped in the terrible packaging of a child's illness and a desperate father's financial limitations. She'd spent her adult life convinced that her daughter was better off without her, that the stability of Marcus's family was worth more than any contribution she could make. But stability meant nothing if it couldn't provide access to the medical care that might save Sofia's life, and Victoria's carefully maintained distance was nothing more than elaborate selfishness if it prevented her from helping when help was desperately needed. The moment of truth had arrived, wrapped in hospital blankets and delivered by a doctor who specialized in the kind of conversations that changed everything, and Victoria finally understood that some choices couldn't be postponed indefinitely without becoming choices by default. The decision, when it came, felt both inevitable and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff while hoping that ground would materialize before impact became unavoidable. Victoria waited until Dr. Patterson had left, and Sofia had been coaxed into the hallway to examine the vending machines with a nurse who understood that adult conversations sometimes required child-sized distractions. Then she looked directly at Marcus, seeing him clearly for the first time, without the buffer of politeness and circumstance that had shaped their earlier interactions. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice carrying the weight of secrets that had been kept too long. "About Sofia. About who I am and why I was driving on that mountain road when my car went into the river." Marcus's expression shifted from polite attention to something approaching wariness, the instinctive caution of someone who'd learned that unexpected revelations usually carried prices that ordinary people couldn't afford to pay. Victoria's confession came in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across 8 years of careful avoidance and deliberate distance. She was Victoria Sterling, she explained, CEO of Sterling Technologies and heir to a fortune that would have been meaningless to most people, except as an abstract concept of wealth beyond imagination. But more importantly, she was Sofia's biological mother, the woman who'd given birth to her during a brief period of youthful uncertainty, and then made the decision to place her for adoption with a family that could provide the stability and love that Victoria's own chaotic circumstances couldn't offer. The private investigators' reports had been arriving for months, she admitted, detailing Sofia's medical diagnosis and the financial strain it was placing on Marcus's family. She'd driven to the mountain retreat not for vacation or solitude, but to wrestle with the question of whether a mother who'd given up her rights to parenthood retained any obligation to help when her child's life hung in the balance. Marcus listened to this explanation with the stillness of someone processing information that changed the fundamental nature of everything he thought he understood about his situation. His face cycled through emotions that Victoria recognized from her own experience of difficult revelations, surprise giving way to confusion, then to something that looked like carefully controlled anger. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of measured calm that suggested he was working very hard to maintain his composure. "You're telling me that you're Sofia's birth mother, and you've been having us investigated like we were suspects in some kind of crime?" The accusation hit Victoria harder than she'd expected, highlighting the ethical ambiguity of monitoring her daughter's life from a distance without acknowledging the relationship that made such interest meaningful. She'd told herself that knowledge without interference was harmless, that caring from afar was better than the disruption that contact might cause. But hearing it described in Marcus's terms made her realize how that kind of surveillance might feel to the people being watched. The explanation that followed was harder than Victoria had anticipated. requiring her to articulate motivations that had seemed clear in private reflection, but which sounded inadequate when spoken aloud to the man who'd taken on the responsibilities she'd abdicated. She'd wanted to help, she insisted, but hadn't known how to offer assistance without seeming to challenge the family structure that had given Sofia stability and love. The money existed to cover any medical expense that might arise, but writing a check felt like trying to buy forgiveness for abandonment, especially when she had no legal relationship to the child whose life she wanted to save. The ethical mathematics of the situation had paralyzed her, she admitted, leaving her trapped between the desire to help and the fear that intervention might do more harm than good. The accident had forced a decision that she might otherwise have delayed indefinitely, bringing her into direct contact with the daughter she'd wondered about, and the man who'd become her father in all the ways that mattered. Marcus's response revealed the depth of his understanding about the complicated territory, where love and law intersected in ways that didn't always serve the best interests of the children caught between them. He'd known about Victoria's existence since he married Sofia's adoptive mother, had even discussed the possibility that Sofia's biological parents might someday want contact. His wife had been pragmatic about such possibilities, recognizing that children deserved access to their complete medical history, and that biological parents who placed children for adoption weren't villains, but people who'd made difficult choices under impossible circumstances. The adoption had been open in theory, allowing for contact if all parties agreed it would benefit Sofia, but Victoria had never reached out, and they'd assumed she preferred the distance that closed adoptions typically maintained. Learning that she'd been monitoring Sofia's life from afar felt like a violation of the trust that open adoption was supposed to create, even if her motivations had been loving rather than intrusive. The conversation that followed revealed the careful balance that Marcus had maintained between honoring Sofia's biological origins and protecting the family unit he'd worked to build after his wife's death. He'd always planned to tell Sofia about her adoption when she was old enough to understand the complexities involved, had even saved letters and photographs that her biological mother had included with the adoption paperwork. But the timing had never seemed right, especially after his wife's death when Sofia was already dealing with the trauma of losing the only mother she remembered. Adding questions about identity and biological family to a grieving 8-year-old's emotional burden had seemed unnecessarily cruel, particularly when her medical situation demanded all her energy for fighting, rather than processing complicated family dynamics. He'd planned to wait until she was healthy and stable before introducing the topic of her origins, but Victoria's unexpected appearance had accelerated that timeline in ways that made careful preparation impossible. The sound of Sofia's laughter in the hallway provided a counterpoint to the serious conversation unfolding in the hospital room, reminding both adults that their discussion involved a real child with immediate needs rather than abstract questions about parental rights and responsibilities. Victoria found herself studying Marcus's face as he wrestled with decisions that would affect his daughter's future, recognizing in his expression the same fierce protectiveness that had driven her own choice to place Sofia for adoption. He loved this child with the complete devotion of someone who'd chosen parenthood deliberately, who'd taken on responsibilities that biology hadn't assigned, but which commitment had made unbreakable. The knowledge that Victoria could solve Sofia's medical problems with a phone call and a transfer of funds created an obligation that transcended legal relationships, but it also raised questions about what such assistance might cost in terms of family stability and Sofia's sense of security about her place in the world. Marcus's final question cut through the theoretical discussions and forced Victoria to confront the practical implications of her revelation. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, his tone suggesting that he understood they'd moved beyond abstract conversations about identity and responsibility into territory where decisions had immediate consequences for a sick child's welfare. Victoria had spent months imagining this conversation, but the reality of it felt different from her rehearsed scenarios. She was proposing to pay for whatever medical care Sofia needed, she explained, using her resources to ensure access to the best possible treatments regardless of cost. But she wasn't asking for custody or visitation rights, wasn't trying to disrupt the family relationships that had given Sofia love and stability. She wanted to be Sofia's mother in the only way that seemed appropriate given the circumstances, by providing the kind of support that her wealth could offer, while respecting the emotional bonds that Marcus and his wife had created through years of daily care and devotion. The terms of Victoria's proposal were more generous than Marcus had expected, and more complicated than a simple financial transaction. She would establish a medical trust that covered not only Sofia's current treatment needs, but also any future complications that might arise from her condition. The fund would be administered through the hospital's financial office, making payments directly to medical providers without requiring Marcus to accept charity or acknowledge Victoria's involvement unless he chose to do so. But the arrangement came with one condition that revealed the depth of Victoria's own needs as much as her desire to help Sofia. She wanted the opportunity to know her daughter, not as a biological parent with rights and expectations, but as someone who cared about Sofia's welfare and wanted to be part of her life in whatever capacity felt appropriate to everyone involved. The relationship would develop naturally, without pressure or predetermined outcomes, allowing Sofia to decide how much contact felt comfortable as she grew older and better understood the complexities of her family situation. Marcus's agreement came slowly, after a long silence during which he seemed to weigh every possible consequence of accepting help that came with emotional complications. He couldn't afford to refuse assistance that might save his daughter's life, but he also couldn't ignore the risks that came with allowing Victoria to become part of Sofia's world. The child had already experienced too much loss and uncertainty for her age, and introducing new relationships carried the possibility of additional heartbreak if Victoria decided that actual parenting was more difficult than she'd anticipated. But the alternative was watching Sofia's condition worsen, while treatments that might save her remained financially out of reach, and Marcus had learned that parenthood sometimes required accepting help, even when it came with strings attached. The decision felt like choosing between two different kinds of risk, but only one of them offered the possibility of Sofia surviving to adulthood with her health intact. The conversation might have continued longer, delving into details and contingencies that legal documents would eventually need to address, but Sofia's return from her exploration of the hospital corridors shifted the focus back to immediate concerns. She bounced into the room with the resilience that had characterized her approach to everything from chemotherapy to her mother's death, carrying a candy bar that the vending machine nurse had helped her select. Her presence transformed the atmosphere from one of careful negotiation to something more like family conference, 3 people gathered around a hospital bed to discuss decisions that would shape their shared future. Victoria found herself studying her daughter's face with new intensity, looking for traces of her own features, while marveling at the personality traits that had clearly developed through Marcus's influence. Sofia was confident without being demanding, curious without being intrusive, kind without being naive about the world's capacity for disappointment. The explanation that Marcus provided for Sofia was carefully calibrated to her age and emotional capacity, presenting Victoria's identity as a pleasant surprise rather than a dramatic revelation that might upset the foundation of everything Sofia thought she knew about her family. Victoria was a special friend, Marcus explained, someone who'd known Sofia's first mother before she died and who wanted to help make sure that Sofia had access to the best possible medical care. The relationship was presented as an extension of the love that had already surrounded Sofia, rather than a challenge to existing bonds, allowing the child to process the information without feeling that she had to choose between different versions of family loyalty. Sofia accepted this explanation with the matter-of-fact adaptability that had carried her through other major changes in her young life, asking practical questions about whether Victoria would visit again and whether she liked the color, which were apparently the criteria by which 8-year-olds evaluated new adults in their lives. Victoria's response to Sofia's questions revealed how much she'd thought about this moment during the years of distance and deliberate separation. She did like the color, she confirmed, and she also enjoyed reading and hiking and building things with her hands, which were interests she developed partly as a way of imagining activities she might someday share with her daughter. She'd brought coloring books and art supplies to every business trip for the past 2 years, carrying them like talismans of possibility, even though she'd never found the courage to arrange a meeting that would make their use possible. The conversation flowed with surprising naturalness, Sofia's questions allowing Victoria to share pieces of herself that felt authentic rather than performative, creating space for a relationship that honored both their biological connection and the family bonds that Marcus had nurtured through years of daily presence and care. The first medical consultation took place 3 days later, in a conference room that looked more like a corporate boardroom than a place where families discussed life-and-death decisions about children's health. Dr. Patterson had assembled a team of specialists that included the region's leading pediatric oncologist, a surgeon who specialized in experimental procedures, and a social worker whose job was ensuring that medical decisions served patients' best interests rather than adult convenience. Victoria sat at one end of the long table, her business attire and obvious wealth marking her as different from the other families who typically participated in such consultations. Marcus sat at the opposite end, wearing the same clean work clothes he'd brought to the hospital. His discomfort with the formal setting obvious, but his determination to understand every option even more apparent. Sofia was present at her own insistence, having declared that conversations about her body should include her voice, which was a level of self-advocacy that impressed even the medical professionals who dealt with articulate children on a regular basis. The treatment options that Dr. Patterson outlined ranged from aggressive but conventional protocols to experimental procedures that were available only at specialized research centers. Sofia's current chemotherapy regimen could be intensified, potentially improving its effectiveness, but also increasing the side effects that had already made eating and sleeping difficult. Alternatively, she could qualify for a clinical trial that was testing new targeted therapies, treatments that attacked cancer cells, while leaving healthy tissue relatively undamaged. The trial was being conducted at a children's hospital in a major metropolitan area, requiring relocation for several months and substantial travel expenses even before considering the cost of experimental treatments that insurance companies were reluctant to cover. But the preliminary results were promising enough to justify hope, offering better outcomes with fewer long-term consequences than traditional approaches could provide. Victoria listened to this medical analysis with the same focused attention she brought to boardroom presentations, taking notes and asking questions that revealed her ability to process complex information quickly and accurately. But Marcus's questions were different, focused on practical considerations that came from experience with medical systems and insurance bureaucracies. He wanted to know about success rates and side effects, but also about logistics and timing, about whether Sofia could continue her education during treatment, and whether the clinical trial would require her to be separated from family support systems for extended periods. The contrast between their approaches highlighted the different perspectives they brought to Sofia's care, Victoria's wealth allowing her to focus on optimal outcomes, while Marcus's experience had taught him that the best theoretical treatment meant nothing if it couldn't be accessed or sustained by real families dealing with real limitations. The financial discussion that followed revealed the scope of the resources that Victoria was prepared to commit to Sofia's treatment, numbers that made even the medical professionals pause, despite their experience with expensive interventions. The clinical trial alone would cost nearly $500,000, including experimental medications, specialized monitoring, and the kind of intensive support services that research protocols required. Traditional insurance would cover perhaps 20% of the total expense, leaving families to navigate the complicated world of charity care, medical loans, and fundraising campaigns that had become standard features of childhood cancer treatment in a system where healing was rationed according to ability to pay. But Victoria's financial commitment went beyond covering immediate expenses to creating a comprehensive support system that would ensure Sofia's access to whatever treatments emerged from ongoing research, effectively removing financial considerations from medical decision-making for the rest of Sofia's life. Marcus's acceptance of this assistance came with visible difficulty. His pride, warring against his love for Sofia in ways that Victoria recognized from her own struggles with accepting help during the early years of building her business. He'd spent his adult life solving problems through hard work and careful planning, and accepting what amounted to charity felt like acknowledging failure even when the circumstances were beyond his control. But Sofia's illness had taught him that some battles required resources that individual determination couldn't provide, that love sometimes meant swallowing pride and accepting assistance that felt uncomfortable but which served a child's needs more effectively than stubborn independence. The conversation revealed the grace with which he'd learned to navigate the complicated territory between accepting help and maintaining dignity, skills that had obviously been developed through the process of caring for his dying wife, and then for a daughter whose medical needs exceeded what working-class families could typically manage. Sofia's reaction to the treatment discussion was characteristically practical, focused more on whether the new medicine would taste better than her current chemotherapy than on the abstract concepts of survival rates and long-term prognosis. She wanted to know if she could bring her art supplies to the hospital where the clinical trial was being conducted, whether her father would be able to stay with her during treatments, and whether Victoria would visit while she was getting better. Her questions revealed the child's intuitive understanding that medical treatment was only part of the healing process, that recovery required emotional support and familiar comforts as much as sophisticated interventions. The adults in the room found themselves adjusting their priorities to match Sofia's wisdom, recognizing that successful treatment meant not just eliminating cancer, but preserving the relationships and activities that made life worth living for an 8-year-old girl who'd already demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of adult-sized challenges. The logistics of relocating for Sofia's treatment revealed how quickly Victoria's wealth could transform impossible situations into merely complicated ones. She arranged for Marcus to take extended leave from his construction job with full pay, officially hiring him as a consultant for a renovation project that would conveniently last exactly as long as Sofia's treatment protocol required. Corporate housing was secured near the children's hospital, a furnished apartment that felt more like a luxury hotel than temporary medical housing, but which provided the kind of stable base that families needed during extended treatment periods. Sofia's school records were transferred to a program that specialized in educating children receiving medical care, ensuring that her academic progress wouldn't suffer while her health was being restored. The arrangements were handled by assistants and specialists whose job was making complex situations manageable, but Victoria insisted on personally overseeing every detail to ensure that Sofia's comfort and family stability remained the primary considerations. The transformation in Sofia's health began almost immediately after starting the experimental treatment, changes that were visible first in subtle improvements in her energy level and appetite, before showing up in the blood work that tracked her body's response to the targeted therapy. Marcus documented every positive sign with the meticulous attention of someone who'd learned not to take progress for granted, photographing Sofia's first full meal in weeks, and celebrating the return of her interest in art projects that had been abandoned during the worst days of traditional chemotherapy. Victoria found herself included in these small celebrations, receiving text messages about Sofia's good days, and being consulted about activities that might help maintain her spirits during the difficult periods that still occurred, even with better treatment. The relationship that developed felt more like extended family than the formal arrangement they'd originally envisioned, natural connections forming around shared concern for Sofia's welfare rather than predetermined expectations about roles and responsibilities. The evening conversations that became routine during Sofia's treatment revealed layers of connection between Victoria and Marcus that went beyond their shared investment in Sofia's recovery. They discovered common interests in books and music, similar perspectives on work and responsibility, and complementary approaches to problem-solving that made difficult decisions easier to navigate together. Marcus's practical wisdom balanced Victoria's tendency to overthink complex situations, while her resources and connections opened possibilities that his experience alone couldn't access. The conversations often continued long after Sofia had fallen asleep, two adults who'd found themselves thrown together by circumstances, learning that compatibility could develop in unexpected ways when people shared genuine respect for each other's strengths and limitations. The night that Sofia's test results confirmed she was in complete remission marked a turning point that felt both like an ending and a beginning, the successful conclusion of one crisis and the start of whatever came next for three people who'd become a family through circumstances none of them could have anticipated. They celebrated quietly in the hospital corridor, Marcus crying with relief, while Victoria held Sofia and whispered promises about all the things they would do together when the medical appointments and treatment schedules no longer dominated their calendar. The future stretched ahead of them with possibilities that had seemed impossible just months earlier, shaped by love that had grown from duty and necessity into something more complex and sustaining. Sofia was healthy, Marcus was free from the financial pressure that had defined his adult life, and Victoria had discovered that motherhood could be learned at any age if the will to love was strong enough to overcome fear and pride. The story that had begun with a car accident in a mountain river had become something none of them had expected, but all of them had needed. Proof that some rescues worked both ways, and that families could be built from the most unlikely materials when circumstances demanded it, and hearts were willing to risk everything for the possibility of connection that transcended traditional boundaries.